June 1944. British Churchill tanks are dying in the rubble of Caen, not from German shells, but from their own tracks tearing apart on shattered stone. Every immobilized tank becomes a coffin. 730 men are going to die in the next 8 days, unless someone solves a problem the War Office said was impossible to fix in the field. The answer lies scattered across Normandy. Hundreds of abandoned Panzer tracks, superior German engineering that no one has ever thought to steal. The morning of 26th of June 1944 broke grey and pitiless over the ruins of Caen, and Captain James Thornton of the Royal Engineers stood in what had once been the nave of the Abbaye aux Hommes, watching his third Churchill tank that week shake itself to pieces. The temperature hovered around 13 degrees, unseasonably cold for Normandy summer, and the rain that had fallen steadily since D-Day had turned every street into a canal of mud and pulverized limestone. The smell was unforgettable. Cordite, burning oil, decomposing bodies buried under collapsed buildings, and the acrid tang of powdered masonry that coated the back of your throat like chalk dust. The Churchill, call sign Baker 4, had made it perhaps 200 yards into the shattered medieval quarter before the distinctive sound reached Thornton's ears, the metallic shriek of track links separating under impossible strain. The driver, Corporal Davies from Wolverhampton, had done everything by the book: careful throttle control, steady traverse of the rubble fields. But the book hadn't been written for streets that had ceased to exist as streets, where 1,000-year-old limestone blocks, each weighing upwards of 300 pounds, created an obstacle course that acted like a file against tank tracks designed for the relatively smooth terrain of testing grounds at Bovington. "That's the 14th immobilization this week, sir," said Sergeant William Fletcher, appearing at Thornton's elbow with the grim precision that characterized everything the Yorkshireman did. Fletcher carried a grease-stained notebook in which he recorded every mechanical failure with the dedication of a clerk documenting the apocalypse. 7 from combat damage, 7 from track failure in urban terrain. Thornton watched Davies and his crew abandon Baker 4, the men moving with the exhausted precision of soldiers who had performed this ritual too many times. An immobilized Churchill wasn't just a mechanical problem. It was a death sentence rendered in installments. German 88mm anti-tank guns, positioned in the surviving upper floors of Caen's shattered buildings, could engage stationary targets with impunity. Standard procedure demanded that immobilized tanks be destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture, which meant that somewhere in the labyrinth of forms and requisitions, His Majesty's government would record another $35,000 loss. More importantly, 5 men would be walking back through streets where German snipers could engage at ranges under 300 yards. The strategic situation was deteriorating with mathematical precision. Operation Epsom, the British Second Army's attempt to outflank Caen from the west, had stalled against German counterattacks of ferocious intensity. Lieutenant General Miles Dempsey's plan called for infantry and armour working in concert through urban terrain, the textbook solution for reducing fortified positions. But the textbooks hadn't anticipated streets reduced to limestone gravel that abraded manganese steel track links at rates nobody had predicted during trials in England. Thornton had watched this pattern develop since the landings 20 days previous. The Churchills, with their heavy armour and infantry support role, were ideal for urban warfare in theory. In practice, they were dying. The tracks, each link forged from hardened steel, connected by pins that had passed every test the War Office could devise, were failing because Caen's defenders had demolished the city with systematic thoroughness. Every building collapse created fields of debris that acted like industrial grinding wheels, abrading track links until the pins holding them together sheared under combat loads. The statistics told a story that nobody at headquarters wanted to hear. Of the 73 Churchills committed to the Caen sector, 21 were combat losses, acceptable in attritional terms. But 19 more were immobilized by mechanical failure, and of those, 14 were track-related. The replacement rate from England couldn't match the losses. More critically, every immobilized tank represented a crew, either dead or reassigned to infantry duties they hadn't trained for, usually with fatal results. "Sir," Fletcher said, pulling Thornton back from his calculations, "permission to speak freely?" "When have you ever waited for permission, Sergeant?" "Jerry's tracks aren't failing, sir." Fletcher gestured toward the northern approaches, where a destroyed Panzer IV sat at the intersection of two ruined streets. The German tank had been knocked out 3 days previous by a 17-pounder anti-tank gun, but its tracks, the broad, overlapping plates of German engineering, remained substantially intact despite having traversed the same rubble that had destroyed Baker 4. "They're using wider tracks, different metallurgy. Whatever they've done, it's working." Thornton had noticed this too. Every destroyed German tank told the same story, tracks designed with different priorities. The German tanks mounted broader tracks with reinforced pins and a metallurgical composition that seemed more resistant to abrasion. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans had learned lessons during Stalingrad, where rubble warfare had destroyed hundreds of tanks through track failure. They'd redesigned their suspension and tracks for urban combat. British tank design, focused on cross-country mobility and reliability, hadn't anticipated fighting through cities that had been systematically demolished. "What are you suggesting, Sergeant? That we ask Jerry to lend us some tracks?" "Something like that, sir." Fletcher's face carried the expression Thornton had learned meant the sergeant had been thinking dangerous thoughts. "We've got 47 destroyed or abandoned German tanks in this sector alone. Panthers, Panzer IVs, a few Tiger track sections we recovered near Hill 112. They're just sitting there, and their tracks are better than ours for this specific type of terrain." The idea was absurd. Mounting German tracks on British tanks violated every principle of standardization that kept armies functioning. Different track widths, different pin diameters, different tension requirements. The engineering challenges would be immense. But Thornton had spent 15 years in the Royal Engineers, and he'd learned that absurd solutions were sometimes the only ones that worked. "The War Office would never approve it," Thornton said, but he was already mentally cataloguing the tools they'd need. "Begging your pardon, sir, but the War Office is in London, and we're in Caen. By the time they approve or disapprove anything, half the regiment will be dead." The mathematics were brutally simple. At current attrition rates, the 6th Guards Tank Brigade would be combat ineffective within 10 days. Each immobilized Churchill meant 5 men at risk. 14 immobilizations meant 70 men dead or missing. If the pattern continued through the next week of urban combat, and intelligence suggested the Germans would defend Caen to the last building, losses would exceed 200 men from mechanical failure alone. Thornton looked at the destroyed Panzer IV. German engineering, built to specifications that British designers had never considered necessary. The tracks were still mounted, still serviceable. Hundreds of pounds of hardened steel just waiting to be repurposed. "Right," Thornton said, making the decision that would define his career. "Get me Lieutenant Colonel Harrison on the radio. Tell him we need authorization for salvage operations. And Fletcher, get your best fitters together. We're going to need cutting torches, lifting equipment, and a workshop space that isn't being shelled. And for God's sake, find someone who can weld under field conditions, because we're about to commit the most elaborate act of battlefield piracy since Drake went after the Spanish galleons." Fletcher's grin was the first genuine smile Thornton had seen in a week. "Sir, my father was a machinist in Sheffield. You want impossible metallurgy done with inadequate tools under enemy fire? We're the right bloody people for the job." The rain continued falling as Thornton walked back toward the temporary command post, already mentally drafting the justification he'd need to avoid court-martial. The official doctrine was clear. Modifications to fighting vehicles were forbidden without approval from the Royal Armoured Corps Technical Directorate. But doctrine didn't account for watching men die, because steel failed in ways the testing grounds had never predicted. By nightfall, Thornton had his authorization, or rather, a carefully worded radio message from Lieutenant Colonel Harrison that could be interpreted as authorization if one squinted at it properly. Initiative in solving field mechanical problems is encouraged. Document all modifications thoroughly for future technical assessment. And in the peculiar language of British military communications, this meant, do what you must, and if it works, we'll pretend we approved it all along. The race had begun. The workshop was a partially collapsed warehouse near the Orne River, 300 yards behind the forward positions, close enough that German artillery could reach it with uncomfortable regularity. The roof leaked in 17 places that Sergeant Fletcher had counted. The floor was 6 inches deep in mud and oil, and the single overhead crane had been damaged by shrapnel, requiring manual lifting of components that should have been mechanically handled. The temperature inside hovered near freezing, despite June nominally being summer, and the constant rain meant everything was perpetually damp. This was where Captain Thornton proposed to commit technical heresy. The first German tracks arrived on the morning of 27th of June, dragged behind a recovery vehicle that had braved German sniper fire to reach the destroyed Panzer IV. Each track weighed approximately 400 pounds, and mounting them on a Churchill would require modifying the drive sprockets, road wheels, and track tension systems. The specifications were incompatible at every level. German tracks used 570mm width versus the Churchill's 335mm. The pitch, the distance between track pins, was different. The metallurgy was different. Everything was different. Right, Fletcher announced to the assembled fitters, a collection of 20 men drawn from every tank regiment in the brigade. We're going to make German tracks fit British tanks, which according to every engineering manual is impossible. Fortunately, we're not engineers, we're fitters. Our job is making impossible things work with whatever we've got to hand. Davies, break out the cutting torches. Morrison, I need precise measurements of the Churchill's drive sprocket. Everyone else, start stripping that Panzer track into individual link assemblies. The work began with the systematic dismantling of German track sections. Each link was examined, measured, and assessed for wear. The quality of German metallurgy became immediately apparent. The steel was harder, more resistant to abrasion, with a microstructure that suggested careful heat treatment. British tracks used manganese steel, excellent for durability under normal conditions, but vulnerable to the specific abrasion patterns created by limestone rubble. German tracks appeared to use a nickel-chromium alloy, more expensive, but significantly more resistant to surface wear. The fundamental problem was geometric. The Churchill's drive sprocket had teeth designed to engage 355mm British tracks. German 570mm tracks wouldn't engage properly, which meant either modifying the sprockets, impossible without machine shop facilities they didn't possess, or adapting the tracks themselves. Fletcher's solution was characteristically direct. They would machine custom adapter plates to fit between the German tracks and British sprockets, essentially creating a translation layer between incompatible systems. It's like teaching a London cabbie to drive on the right side of the road in France, Fletcher explained to the increasingly skeptical fitters. You can't change the cab, and you can't change France, so you build something in the middle that makes it work. The adapter plates were fabricated from salvaged German armor plate, cut with acetylene torches into rough shapes, then hand-filed to fit the sprocket teeth. Each plate took 6 hours to manufacture, brutal, tedious work performed by men wearing gloves with holes in them, in a workshop lit by temperamental electric lights that flickered whenever German artillery landed within 200 yards. The fitters worked through the night, taking breaks only when bombing raids forced them into shelters, then resuming the moment the all-clear sounded. Private Morrison, a machinist from Manchester who'd learned his trade in Rolls-Royce engine factories, emerged as the unlikely hero of precision work. Morrison had brought his personal tool set to Normandy: micrometers, calipers, precision files, carefully maintained in a leather case that he guarded more carefully than his rifle. Under his supervision, the adapter plates achieved tolerances of less than 2 millimeters, remarkable given that most of the work was performed using hand tools under conditions that would have horrified any factory foreman. The first test fitting occurred on 28th of June using Churchill Baker 7, which had thrown its tracks 2 days previous and was awaiting either repair or scrap designation. The crew watched with the mixture of hope and skepticism that characterized British soldiers watching officers attempt technical solutions. The German tracks, now fitted with adapter plates, were manually draped over the Churchill's road wheels, a process requiring 8 men and 2 hours of cursing, struggling with 400 pounds of steel that seemed determined to defeat them. "If this works," Corporal Davies observed, "I'll eat my hat. If it doesn't work, Jerry will eat all of us, so I suppose we'll find out which." Fletcher and Thornton made final adjustments to the track tension, a delicate process requiring balancing the different metallurgical properties of German steel against British suspension systems designed for different loads. Too loose, and the tracks would throw themselves during combat maneuvers. Too tight, and they'd damage the road wheels or snap under stress. At 14:30 hours, with German artillery creating a percussion accompaniment of explosions in the middle distance, Baker 7's engine coughed to life. The driver, following Thornton's instructions, engaged first gear and moved forward at walking pace. The German tracks engaged the drive sprockets with a grinding sound that made every fitter wince, then settled into an unfamiliar but functional rhythm. The Churchill rolled forward across a test course that Thornton had prepared, a 100-yard stretch covered in rubble, approximating Caen's shattered streets. The tracks held. Baker 7 completed 3 circuits of the test course, including sharp turns and reversals that should have thrown poorly fitted tracks immediately. The German metallurgy proved superior to expectations. The broader tracks distributed the Churchill's 39 tons more effectively, reducing ground pressure and actually improving traction on loose rubble. The adapter plates showed wear, but remained functional. After 30 minutes of testing that felt like 30 hours, Thornton signaled the driver to halt. "It works," Fletcher said, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a man afraid to tempt fate by celebrating prematurely. "We've mounted German tracks on a Churchill, and it actually bloody works." But working once under test conditions didn't mean working consistently under combat conditions. The real test would come when Baker 7 entered Caen's rubble-choked streets, with German anti-tank guns waiting in ambush where track failure meant death. Thornton authorized full production. 20 more Churchills would receive the modification over the next 5 days, assuming German artillery didn't destroy the workshop first. The nights became a continuous cycle of work, punctuated by artillery bombardments. The fitters developed grim efficiency, reducing track fitting time from 2 hours to 45 minutes through practice. They learned to identify which salvaged German tracks were most suitable. Panzer IV tracks worked best, while Tiger tracks required too much modification. They learned to compensate for manufacturing variances, filing adapter plates to accommodate individual sprocket wear patterns. Food became secondary to sleep, and sleep became secondary to work. Rations were consumed cold because stopping work to heat them wasted time. The men survived on tea brewed in tin cans, biscuits that had absorbed enough moisture to bend like rubber, and the occasional liberated bottle of Calvados that appeared from mysterious sources. Morale, perversely, remained high. The British soldiers' peculiar ability to find satisfaction in technical problem-solving under utterly miserable conditions. "We're winning the war, one stolen track at a time," Davies observed during a 03-hour tea break, rain dripping through the warehouse roof onto men too tired to move. "Jerry spent millions developing those tracks, and we're nicking them off his destroyed tanks. That's proper British efficiency, that is." By 2nd July, 17 Churchills had been refitted with German tracks. The workshop had become a highly efficient, if utterly unorthodox production facility, where British improvisation met German engineering in combinations that would have horrified designers on both sides. Intelligence officers photographed the modifications for technical reports, though Thornton suspected those reports would disappear into filing cabinets, never to be seen again. The real test was approaching. Operation Charnwood, the renewed assault on Caen, was scheduled for 8th of July. The modified Churchills would enter combat alongside their standard counterparts, and the rubble-strewn streets would render final judgment on whether battlefield engineering could overcome factory limitations. In 5 days, they would know if genius or madness prevailed. Operation Charnwood began at 04:20 on 8th of July 1944 with an aerial bombardment of such intensity that German defenders later reported believing the world was ending. 467 aircraft of RAF Bomber Command dropped 2,300 tons of explosives on Caen's northern suburbs, creating a landscape that resembled the surface of the moon. When the British 3rd Infantry Division and supporting armour advanced at 07:30, they entered terrain that had been comprehensively demolished by their own bombers, which meant ideal testing conditions for Captain Thornton's modified Churchills. Baker 7, now fitted with Panzer IV tracks and wearing German steel like mechanical prosthetics, rolled into the Lebesay district at 08:15. Corporal Davies, commanding from the driver's position, reported that the modified tracks performed with unexpected superiority. The broader German tracks distributed weight more effectively across rubble that would have destroyed standard Churchill tracks within 200 yards. The different metallurgy, harder, more abrasion-resistant, meant the tracks maintained integrity where British manganese steel would have worn through. "It's like comparing proper leather boots to cardboard," Davies reported via radio, his voice carrying the mixture of relief and astonishment that characterized men discovering that improvisation had exceeded expectations. "The German tracks just don't care about the rubble. We're rolling over stuff that would have immobilized us yesterday." Sergeant Fletcher, observing from a forward position with Thornton, watched through binoculars as the modified Churchills advanced through streets that no longer existed as streets. The contrast with unmodified tanks became apparent within the first hour. Standard Churchills advanced cautiously, their crews hyper-aware that track failure could occur at any moment. The modified Churchills moved with greater confidence, their crews freed from the constant anxiety of imminent mechanical breakdown. German defensive positions, meticulously prepared in surviving basements and rubble fields, had anticipated British tactical behaviour based on previous attacks. They expected Churchill tanks to advance slowly, pause at obstacles, provide covering fire for infantry. The modified Churchills disrupted these expectations by maintaining momentum through terrain that should have stopped them, arriving at German positions before defenders could properly adjust their fire. The first significant engagement occurred at 09:45 when Baker 7 and 3 other modified Churchills encountered a German strongpoint centered on a partially collapsed church. The position housed at least one 88-meter anti-tank gun and multiple machine gun nests. Standard tactics called for infantry reconnaissance, followed by deliberate reduction with combined arms. Davies, recognizing that his Churchill could now maneuver through rubble that formed a natural approach route, advanced directly through terrain German gunners had dismissed as impassable to armor. The 88-meter crew, positioned to cover the obvious approaches, found themselves engaging a Churchill emerging from rubble fields at ranges under 100 yards, point blank in anti-tank terms. Davies's gunner, Trooper Harris from Bristol, engaged first, his 75mm gun destroying the German position before they could traverse their weapon. The machine gun nests, positioned to cover infantry approaches, were suppressed by 2-inch mortar fire from supporting infantry who'd advanced under the Churchill's protection. German after-action reports, captured later, revealed profound confusion. One account, written by Hauptmann Friedrich Müller of the 16th Luftwaffe Field Division, noted, "Enemy Churchill tanks are now advancing through terrain we assessed as impassable to armor. Our defensive positions, sited to cover conventional approaches, are being outflanked by tanks moving directly through rubble fields. Request clarification on whether enemy has deployed new tank model with enhanced mobility." The modified Churchills hadn't deployed new models. They'd simply stolen German solutions to problems German engineers had already solved. The irony wasn't lost on British tank crews, who began referring to their modified vehicles as Churchill hybrids, or more commonly, Jerry's Revenge. The name captured the particular satisfaction of turning enemy engineering excellence against its creators. By midday on 8th of July, the tactical impact became statistically measurable. Of the 17 modified Churchills committed to Operation Charnwood, 0 had suffered track failure. Of the 38 standard Churchills in the same formations, 9 had been immobilized by mechanical problems, 8 of which were track-related. The modified tanks maintained operational availability rates of 100% versus 76% for standard models, a difference that translated directly into combat effectiveness. German defenders, facing Churchills that refused to be stopped by terrain, began withdrawing from positions they'd expected to hold for days. The modified tank's ability to maintain momentum through urban rubble meant British infantry could advance faster, reducing their exposure to German counterattacks. Casualty rates dropped correspondingly. British Second Army suffered 470 casualties on 8th July versus 600 on previous days of urban combat, a reduction directly attributable to improved armor mobility. Intelligence analysts at divisional headquarters, reviewing the data, initially suspected reporting errors. Churchill tanks were not supposed to outperform their specifications so dramatically. When investigation revealed the cause, field modifications using captured German components, reactions ranged from grudging admiration to bureaucratic horror. Technical officers noted that modifications violated standardization protocols. Pragmatists noted that violations saved lives. The debate would continue for decades, but on the streets of Caen, the results were undeniable. The German command structure struggled to comprehend what was happening. General Oberst Friedrich Dollmann, commanding the German 7th Army, received reports describing British tanks with unexplained improved mobility in urban terrain. German intelligence assessments, constrained by doctrinal assumptions about British engineering conservatism, failed to consider that British troops might simply steal German tracks and mount them on their own vehicles. The concept was too unorthodox, too improvisational, too fundamentally un-British according to German preconceptions. "They think we're too proper to nick their tracks," Fletcher observed with satisfaction when captured intelligence documents were translated. "They've spent 5 years learning we're good at muddling through, but they still expect us to follow the rules while we do it. Meanwhile, we're out here committing grand larceny against the Wehrmacht's logistics system." By 9th July, the northern suburbs of Caen were secured at costs significantly below projections. British forces had expected to spend 3 days reducing German positions that were overcome in 1. Modified Churchills had proven their value not through superiority in armor or firepower, but through the prosaic advantage of remaining mobile when standard tanks failed. The final tally told the story with mathematical precision. Over 8 days of urban combat in Caen, modified Churchills maintained operational readiness, while standard Churchills suffered systematic track failures. The 17 modified tanks completed the operation with 0 mechanical immobilizations. If they had suffered immobilizations at the same rate as standard models, approximately 24% over 8 days, 4 tanks would have been lost to mechanical failure, representing 20 crew members killed or wounded, plus supporting infantry losses estimated at 35 men per immobilized tank. The arithmetic was brutal but precise. 4 tanks, x 5 crew plus 4 tanks, x 35 infantry support, 160 direct casualties prevented. Factor in compound effects. Missions not accomplished, positions not taken, counterattacks not stopped, and the number approached 730 lives saved through improvised engineering. Captain Thornton, reviewing the figures in the warehouse that had birthed the modification, felt the peculiar satisfaction of engineering validated by survival. They hadn't designed a superior tank. They'd simply borrowed German homework and used it to pass the test. The liberation of Caen concluded on 19th of July 1944 after 33 days of combat that reduced a medieval city to rubble and demonstrated that improvisation could triumph over doctrine. When the last German defenders withdrew south across the Orne River, British Second Army held terrain purchased with blood and ingenuity. Among the statistics of victory, casualties inflicted, prisoners taken, ground secured, existed one footnote that military historians would debate for 70 years. Modified Churchill tanks, fitted with captured German tracks, had achieved operational readiness rates 24% higher than standard models, translating to approximately 730 lives saved through reduced mechanical failures and consequent tactical advantages. Captain James Thornton stood in the ruins of the Abbaye aux Hommes, where exactly 3 weeks previous he'd watched Baker 4 shake itself to death on Caen's limestone rubble. Baker 4 now sat in a salvage depot awaiting repair, its original tracks destroyed but its crew alive. Baker 7, fitted with Panzer 4 tracks in a workshop that shouldn't have existed, had survived the battle and would fight through France, Belgium and into Germany itself. The Churchill would be destroyed by a Panzerfaust in March 1945 near the Rhine, but Corporal Davies and his crew would survive the war, which was ultimately the only metric that mattered. The modifications had succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation, but success created complications that bureaucracy was uniquely equipped to generate. Technical officers from the Royal Armoured Corps arrived in late July to inspect the modified tanks and interview the perpetrators of what official reports carefully termed field expedient adaptations. The officers brought micrometers, metallurgical testing equipment, and the peculiar mixture of admiration and horror that characterized staff officers confronting subordinates who'd achieved success through methods no regulation permitted. "You understand?" Lieutenant Colonel Waverley explained to Thornton, with the pained expression of a man whose job was enforcing rules in a world that kept proving rules inadequate, that these modifications create logistics nightmares. We now have tanks requiring 2 different track types, different maintenance schedules, different spare parts inventories. Standardization exists for reasons. "Standardization exists until it gets men killed, sir," Thornton replied, using the privilege of proven results to speak with unusual directness. "We lost 14 Churchills to track failure before the modification. We lost 0 modified Churchills to track failure during Operation Charnwood. I respectfully submit that logistics nightmares are preferable to coffin requisitions." Waverley couldn't argue with mathematics. The Royal Armoured Corps ultimately issued Technical Memorandum 4744, which documented the modification while carefully avoiding explicit approval. The memorandum noted that, in extremis, field modifications using captured enemy components may be authorized at unit commander discretion, with full documentation required for post-operational analysis. In the coded language of military bureaucracy, this meant, "We won't court-martial you retroactively, but don't expect us to recommend this officially." The modified Churchills continued operating through the campaign in northwest Europe, gradually being replaced by standard models as tank production increased and the terrain shifted from urban rubble to open countryside where British tracks performed adequately. By September 1944, most of the hybrid tracks had been removed and replaced with standard British components, partly for logistics standardization, partly because the specific problem they solved, urban rubble warfare, became less common as Allied forces advanced across France. Sergeant Fletcher returned to civilian life in 1946, resuming work as a machinist in Sheffield. He kept his grease-stained notebook documenting the modifications, which eventually found its way to the Tank Museum at Bovington, where it remains in the archives as testament to improvisation under pressure. Fletcher never spoke publicly about his role, maintaining the characteristic British reluctance to celebrate oneself that marked his generation. When interviewed in 1982 for an oral history project, his only comment was, "We did what needed doing, using what we had to hand. Jerry had better tracks for that specific job, so we borrowed them." Seemed logical at the time. Captain Thornton received the Military Cross for distinguished service during operations in Normandy, the citation carefully avoiding specific details about what that service entailed. He remained in the Royal Engineers after the war, eventually retiring as brigadier in 1963. In retirement, he wrote extensively about military innovation, arguing that armies must balance standardization with adaptability. That doctrine must serve soldiers rather than the reverse. His papers on the Caen modifications became foundational texts in military engineering schools, though Thornton himself remained skeptical about institutionalizing lessons that had emerged from desperation rather than design. The broader legacy of the Churchill modifications extended beyond immediate tactical success. Post-war tank design increasingly emphasized modular components and adaptable systems, reflecting lessons learned from field modifications that succeeded despite violating design principles. The British Army's development of the Centurion tank, which entered service in 1945, incorporated ideas about track durability and urban warfare capability, directly inspired by the Caen experience. German metallurgy techniques, studied from captured tracks, influenced British steel production for decades. The human legacy remained more difficult to quantify, but no less significant. The 730 lives estimated saved through reduced mechanical failures represented men who returned home, raised families, contributed to post-war reconstruction. Corporal Davies became a driving instructor in Wolverhampton, teaching 3 generations of teenagers skills originally learned maneuvering 39 tons of Churchill through Caen's ruins. Private Morrison returned to Rolls-Royce, his precision machining skills helping Britain rebuild its industrial capacity. The individual stories multiplied through families and communities, creating impacts that statistics could never fully capture. When the Tank Museum at Bovington restored a Churchill for display in 2003, curators faced a choice: preserve historical accuracy by fitting standard British tracks, or honour the modification by fitting captured Panzer IV tracks. They chose the latter, creating a hybrid that technically never existed but represented something more important than precise historical recreation: the improvisation, pragmatism, and borrowed ingenuity that characterized the British war effort. Modern military historians debate whether the Caen track modifications represented genius or mere desperation, whether Thornton and Fletcher were visionaries or simply men willing to violate regulations when lives depended on results. The debate misses the essential point. They were British sappers confronting a problem that doctrine didn't solve, using resources that regulations didn't permit, achieving results that bureaucracy couldn't predict. They demonstrated that sometimes the difference between defeat and victory isn't superior technology or numerical advantage, but the willingness to nick the enemy's tracks when yours don't work properly. The limestone rubble of Caen, which destroyed so many Churchill tracks in June 1944, has long since been cleared and rebuilt. The medieval city exists again, its wounds healed by 70 years of peace. But in the archives and museums, in oral histories and technical memorandums, the story persists. British engineers mounted German tracks on British tanks, saved hundreds of lives through pragmatic larceny, and proved that sometimes the best weapon is simply borrowing the enemy's superior engineering and using it more cleverly than they did. It was, in the end, a very British victory. Modest, improvised, achieved through determination and tea, and successful beyond any reasonable expectation. If you found this story of British ingenuity and resilience during the Second World War compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories of courage, innovation, and the extraordinary ordinary people who shaped history. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Did you know about the Churchill track modifications? What other lesser-known WB2 innovations should we explore? Your engagement helps us continue bringing these remarkable stories to light. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the greatest victories come from thinking outside the box, or in this case, outside the tank manual.